Hi, I'm Vic Chopra.
And I'm Spencer Oberg.
We are the co-founders of Unincarcerated Productions.
This is Unincarcerated, the podcast.
Here's our host, Cameron Collins.
You might be asking yourself right about now, what does it mean to be unincarcerated? Well, at Unincarcerated Productions, the belief is that it means to be liberated from imprisonment of any form and empowered to realize one's highest potential. On Season 1 of Unincarcerated, the podcast, we are going to sit down with each member of the Unincarcerated team and learn about what brought them to being part of Unincarcerated Productions and where they see Unincarcerated going. This is Unincarcerated, the podcast, Season 1. On this episode, we sit down with Rachel Kjack, the COO of Unincarcerated. Having grown up next to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington, Rachel witnessed the criminal justice system inside and out, and this caused her to develop a sense of social justice from a young age. Because of this, she moved into the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion training, and is even taught in prisons. This is our conversation with Rachel. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Living the COVID life. How about you?
Totally. Me too.
So let's learn a little bit more about you before we learn about what you have done and are going to do with Unincarcerated. You grew up in Walla Walla.
Yes, I did.
Which, even as a kid, going through Walla Walla constantly, because my dad was from Waitsburg, there was always jokes around the state pen in Walla Walla. If you weren't good, you were going to end up there. Somebody was breaking out of there, whatever it was. Every time we drove past, there were jokes. It seems like the state pen is kind of not the center of life in Walla Walla, but a major factor in people's lives. What was that like growing up there in Walla Walla?
Yeah, it absolutely was. So it's also a town with 3 colleges. And so there's a very weird mix of culture and wealth with poverty and with lack of freedom and just sort of this ominous, institution on the side of town. And so growing up, actually, my dad taught at one of the colleges, and they called the Penn the North Campus because back in the 70s and early 80s, they had college classes in prison. And then politically, it went out of favor, and Get Tough on Crime came in. And so then all of that went away. But he taught at the penitentiary along with a lot of his fellow faculty when I was a kid. So every dinner conversation was about, stuff that was going on at the pen and, people who they met there that were inmates, which is not my favorite word for people who are incarcerated, but that's what they called it. And I remember one time I was babysitting for this family, and we came home from the park or wherever, and the door was ajar, the front door. And this is before cell phones, and the landline rang, and I answered it, and it was my mom, and she was like, somebody got escaped from the pen, somebody's loose. And that was like a prevailing experience of growing up in Walla Walla is, like you said, if you don't behave, you're going to end up there, or somebody's going to get out and, look out and that sort of thing, which is kind of silly if you think about it, because the last place anybody would want to stay if they escaped from the pen is the town that it was in. So, but there's all kinds of signs out on the highway, like don't pick up hitchhikers and, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think it made a huge impression on me. Also growing up with some of the kids of floater families that had moved to the area, so they could have visitation and actually see their loved ones. And kind of the lived experience of families that, their dad or their uncle or whoever was, or their brother was in the pen. And so I grew up with a lot of people that was their reality. And I even remember going to yard sales with my mom as a kid and seeing prison issue clothing being sold at the yard sale. So when I was in high school, it was the cool, bad kid thing to do to have prison issue attire. Right.
Yeah.
So
now in your current life, beyond being the CEO of Unincarcerated, you're also working diversity and inclusion as a consultant. What was it that took you from that path? What was it that took you from that life in Walla Walla that led you down that path to where you are now? Was there something that you were able to take away from growing up in a place where the state penitentiary was a part of your life in that way that you took away from there as you moved on in your life?
Well, the first seed was planted by my mom, actually. She made a really conscious effort to introduce us to other kids and families who didn't look like us, didn't come from the same background. And so I think that that was a really early seed that was planted before I was even in school. But then in high school, I ran the high school newspaper and was really into journalism, thought that's what I wanted to do in life. And there was a execution that was scheduled, I believe it was my senior year. And all of these right to lifers came to town, all of these people that were all about this guy getting murdered, and literally were coming and like having drinking parties around, this guy's execution. It was a big deal because it was the first execution that was going to be done in like 30 years. And so people came from all over the country, were on the national news. And I just thought, this is insane. Like, regardless of what this person did and obviously the people that he hurt, what is this like fervor around, caring so much about like punishment and, killing somebody. And there was just a lot of sensationalism that happened around that. And so it really made a huge impact on me. And then when I went to college, I went to my undergrad at a very hippie liberal arts school, Evergreen in Olympia. And the day that I got there to move in, students were chaining themselves to trees because they were clear cutting the forest nearby to build a housing development. And I remember my mother like not wanting to leave me there. And I was thinking, you have no idea how much this is the perfect place for me right now, because I've been dealing with just so much, not only the insanity of the person that was up for execution, but also when I was in middle school or junior high and high school, people that I knew were on multiple talk shows. If you remember back, Geraldo was one of them, Oprah, Donahue. And so I would literally come home from school and watch these shows and see people that I knew. And nowadays it feels like, reality TV is such part of our lives, but this was early, right? This was like in the early 90s. And to see sort of like things that were playing out in my town, the racial disparity, which was what the Oprah episode was about. And before Mary Kay Letourneau and all that kind of stuff, there was a teacher that had an affair with one of the students who was somebody that I knew. So that was all playing out, and just, seeing that stuff play out on a national stage or even international was super impacting to me. And so I think those were all of the like early life things that kind of played into why I am now in diversity and inclusion. But it wasn't a straight path by any means. It wasn't like I've done this my whole life. I used to do social justice work on the side. I worked in the foster care system and a bunch of other things. I worked at a Native American reservation. I did all this different stuff. But I always kind of had my day job in corporate America. And at some point I was like, how do these two parts of myself come together? Right. And to not feel that duality of, my own existence and like what I wanted to do in the world. So diversity and inclusion as a profession became like more of a thing. And I was like, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to do. So all my background in like organizational development and leadership development, and all that kind of stuff fed right into being able to do consulting and training. Because I'd been doing it anyway. I just hadn't been solely focused on inclusion and equity and belonging and all of those things. And so that's kind of how I ended up in this line of work. But I feel like I've always been doing it. I kind of feel like my, perspective, my values in the world are about leveling the playing field and creating more access and opportunity for people that don't come from privilege.
For those that don't know, I know you said Evergreen is a hippie school, but it is known for its activism, especially on the Bachelor of Arts side of campus. I know the science people aren't really as much into that, but you were there when the Riot Girl movement was in full force, had been around for a few years by then. Did you interact with the Riot Girl? I mean, music being my background, I thought this would be an interesting question. Did you interact with the Riot Girl movement at all? And especially it being based kind of out of Olympia and then later Olympia and DC? Was it something that you interacted with and were a part of?
Music was a big part of my life. That was kind of early stage. There was this surge, like huge surge of like music, and zines were a big thing. And, everybody was like hanging out at, this is going to date me, but Kinko's, drinking pots of coffee and like photocopying stuff at like, 2:00 in the morning or however late they stayed open. And so, yeah, I mean, there was, and then K Records, and, we went down to the Ole Theater and saw shows all the time. And, I didn't get a lot of sleep during that time period. That way. There was definitely like the punk scene, and a lot of girls with a lot of piercings, more than me for sure. But I felt like that was sort of an interesting time period because I wasn't really into mainstream music during that period. Whereas growing up in a smaller town, like all we had was classic rock, country, Bible stations on the radio. And so that was like my first exposure. And I dove in head first. I used to have the most amazing record collection. And I remember the day I went to the guy in Olympia, this was much later in life, and went into the record store and was like, I'm ready to sell this collection. And he literally was trying to talk me out of it because I had so much amazing stuff. It was like rare and signed and all this stuff. And I was like, look, I realize a lot of this shit's never even going to see the shelf. I realize that this is going into your collection, and I am Merry Christmas, right? Because I just was tired of packing it around. I got to a point in life where I was like, I've moved so much and been so nomadic. I just can't pack this, record collection around anymore. And I've told that story. In fact, I was dating somebody once I told that story to, and he literally was like, I can't go out with you anymore. Like, that's just wrong. Yeah. So
I mean,
yeah.
it's tough. No matter how much I declutter, which I'm constantly decluttering and then recluttering. So what's the point? That's the one thing that's been the constant, has been my record collection. So I get it. I get why you wanting to get rid of it, and it's heavy. Those things are not light. But
yeah,
man, think about what you'd have today if you'd kept them.
I know. Yeah, I still have some pretty cool memorabilia, just not the records, but I also have some, like I said, pictures of me and some of my friends who were artists and activists and filmmakers and all this stuff. And so there's quite a bit of footage of shenanigans that went on from back then. I was a bit of a wild child.
So how did the activism you did through art, through cultural stuff shape you at that time? I feel like the college years, at least the age, whether or not you're in college, that's a time that can really shape who you become as an adult. How do you think what you experienced there set the values that you would then use later, even in the corporate world?
It made me feel like my bumper sticker was like, purpose oriented or die. Like I was totally fine being outside of the dominant culture. And I got really comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think traveling for a year after high school and before going to Evergreen made a huge difference in terms of like my worldview and, life experience that I was bringing into that. And so for some people, they go to college and they're like, oh, I got, I sowed my oats, I got this out of my system or whatever. For me, it fueled my fire. It made me go into corporate America and immediately be dissatisfied, immediately want to change the status quo, immediately feel like, is this all there is? So I had my midlife crisis when I was like 21.
Yeah. How do you come out of that environment and go into the corporate world and stick with it? I mean, I know you went out and you wanted to change it, but how did you stick with it? Were you seeing results? Were you seeing changes take place, or were you just hoping that eventually you'd be able to implement those changes?
Well, I remember thinking that I wasn't being taken seriously as a young female professional. And I remember thinking, I'm going to have to get some years on me before I get the respect that I deserve and want in order to have, I'm doing air quotes right now, but like authority to make changes. And I have a long game view on life. Like I'm willing to stay this path for the whole duration of my life in order to make change, in order to see things happen. And I have, right? Like I've been in the professional world now for well over 20 years. And I think that what was true for me, where, I definitely had jobs that like I was called honey and gal, and I'm not exaggerating. And, had experiences like I worked for a pretty prolific nonprofit that touched into a lot of different sectors and was very prominent in Portland, Oregon at the time. And I remember the president of the board saying to me one day in a meeting in front of everybody, "Are you pregnant?" And I wasn't. But there had been rumors that I was leaving the organization because I was starting my own business. And so of course the only reason that could be is because I'm preggers, right? And I looked at him and I was like, no, maybe I just look fat to you. Because I had to, call him out in some way. And he was like, oh, no, that's not what I mean. And I knew that's not what he meant, but I wanted to, stick it to him. But yeah, and so I had a lot of experiences like that early on where I just felt like, what the fuck? So that's why the social justice stuff and my involvement in the music scene was on the side for a long time. And I literally had two wardrobes. Like if you looked in my closet, you would see like the wild child side, and then there would be kind of the more corporate-y, I never wear khaki pants, but that side of the wardrobe. And I remember having that thought every time I looked in my closet, is like, I am two different people in these different worlds. And I hear that a lot actually from people who identify as being from a marginalized group, is that they feel that way now. And I feel like I have the privilege, being kind of in the right age range, right? I'm not too young and I'm not too old yet to be taken seriously and not be dealing with ageism. And I'm white, right? To be able to speak my truth in corporate America now and get heard. And so I want to use that voice in a effective and positive way. But yeah, there were a lot of years where I was like, just what the fuck? I would go home and cry and on my way home, driving home and like rocking out to music just to kind of like get the angst out. Yeah, I think that there were a lot of years there that were definitely hard, because I would make suggestions for things that I thought really were important. And it was like either I wouldn't get heard at all, or I'd be told that I was being too this or too that. I was always too big, too loud, too demanding, too emotional, too whatever. And in retrospect, that was all bullshit. That was all just not getting the respect that I felt like I deserved. That being said, I also think that there's some youthful angst that benefits from maturity and learning how to talk to people really effectively, and building like your social and emotional intelligence, so that you're not just like calling people out on stuff, but really like working with them instead of, against them.
It seems like all of that experience would play directly into not just a yearn to do diversity inclusion work, but to be good at it then, because you've seen it, what happens when it's wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm still learning. I'm still in the work. Yeah, so I've been even recently working with a co-facilitator who is the daughter of a civil rights leader who was part of the protests in Selma and worked closely with Martin Luther King Jr. And boy, I thought I understood some things, but she has schooled me recently in some areas that I'm super grateful for. And, it bumps up against my need to be seen as competent. Like that's an important thing with me, is to like do the homework, figure it out, not ask people from marginalized groups to teach it to me, but, do my own work and also do work on myself. Right. So I show up in a way where I understand my privilege. And so it's really important for me. I care a lot, and probably too much sometimes. And it's really important for me to be authentic in this work and to model that authenticity, especially in corporate America, where it's not always, valued.
What role do you think your work in diversity and inclusion, but also your work on yourself, has played with the work you've done in prisons?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So the work that I do in diversity and inclusion has been impacting the work in prisons and vice versa. So when I go into prison, I am very aware of the fact that I get to leave at the end of this, class or whatever it is. And that I'm walking into a situation that is very traumatic that people are living in every single day. And so before any learning can happen or any teaching can happen, there has to be some opportunity for centering and grounding in relationship. Like, change and learning and all that happens in relationship with each other. And in order for there to be, a good foundation for that to happen, you got to recognize where you're at, and you got to recognize your own privilege. And so I'm very aware of that. And part of that awareness by going into prison so often, like before COVID anyway, is that every time I walk into corporate America and I see the disparity between, just everything that people have in corporate America that they take for granted, or that seems to be taken for granted, at least collectively, maybe not individually. I can't take that lens off of what I experienced going into prison. And so I bring in stories and examples and whatever into corporate America from prison all the time because it's so part of me now. I don't think of them as separate. All the way to wanting to have more of a pipeline of talent from people who are formerly incarcerated into not just corporate America, but, into jobs that they want to do, right? Because oftentimes it's like, well, they can get a job doing janitorial. Well, what if they don't want to do janitorial, right? What if they have mad skills and are super resilient and have something to teach the rest of us? Because oftentimes they do. So that's sort of the broad piece to it. And in terms of the work on myself, I've thought a lot about this and I haven't come to like what I think is the ultimate answer for me. I'm trying to figure it out, but there's something for me about believing in second chances and also believing in first chances in some cases that people never really had one. I was a wild child and, I've done things where I could have been arrested and wasn't. And I've had a lot of opportunities for do-overs that I don't think everybody has. And so for me, that's why I care so much about doing things well and right and ethically. And I care very much about how I show up in spaces with people because I don't think I always showed up the way that I wanted to, or even thought about what that was. And so I think just continuing to be in relationship with people and doing the work, even though it's really hard sometimes. I think that's what's really important for me personally.
You worked as a trainer and curriculum developer at San Quentin and then also up here in Monroe. But San Quentin, I think, is a name that resonates throughout the country. It's probably one of the more famous prisons. Had you been in a prison before you went in there to teach for the first time?
Yeah, actually, I went into prison for the first time when I was 19 years old in a sociology class that was at the community college in Walla Walla. So I went into the prison, of my childhood, growing up around, and it made a huge impact on me. One of the things that happened was we got to be in a room with 3 people who had been convicted of murder and ask them anything we want. And it was a mind-blowing conversation for a 19-year-old to have. And I remember thinking, they seem like normal people, right? Like that was the biggest surprise to me. And then also we went to have lunch in the cafeteria in minimum security. And as we're going through the lunch line, I hear somebody say, Rachel. And it was this guy I had worked at. I had worked in food service like all through high school. And it was somebody who'd been a cook at one of the restaurants that I had worked at. And a bunch of my fellow classmates looked at me like, you know him? And we were like, yeah, hey, and I was like, A, this is super weird, but B, like it's so like, it's normal, right? It's a normal interaction that we're having. And before not having had that experience, I had this whole like mythological perception of the prison, So by the time I went into San Quentin, what was different about San Quentin though, is this set of buildings is really ominous. Like if you think about the stuff you see on TV, the old Gothic style prison, and also it sits right at the top of the bay. So it's got this amazing water view. And then you go in through these huge iron gates and you're like in, right? You're locked in. And the first thing that happens when you get through security is you come out into this courtyard that's really, really beautiful. It's got all the different chapels for the different religions. And you look over to the left and it says Adjustment Center in Old English lettering. And when I was there for the first time, it was summer and I could hear people screaming from the other side because the windows were open because they kept the windows open for airflow. And that was where, a lot of famous people have been held that were criminally insane, et cetera, et cetera. Like that's the first thing you experience when you walk into San Quentin, and it's just like, whoo. And then you go through this whole pathway down to the yard, down to this classroom that I was at. And in the side of the building, there were like cages facing the outside to the elements, and they don't use them anymore because it's considered, torture. But back in the day, if people would get in trouble inside, they would get put outside in these cells, which literally looked like a zoo cage. And they were exposed to the elements for God knows how long. And so that makes a hell of an impression on you. And And then to go from there out to the portable classrooms at the end of the yard, where the second you walk on the yard, like 500 people turn and look at you because you're the only woman and you're wearing red. Like that was super trippy. And then the Native American area where they get to keep a fire going and have their, religious services and stuff is right next to these portables. And so I met all of these really amazing people as soon as we got over there, waiting to get into the classroom because they got to go in and they got to do a sweep and security and whatever before we could go in. And then this program was the California Reentry Institute, and the woman who runs it, Colette Carroll, she is a CNN hero. She's a hero of mine, and this little Spitfire Australian woman. And she introduced me to the class, and I was terrified. I was like, oh my God, shit just got real. And there were probably about 30 or 40 people that were all within 2 years of parole, potential parole. It doesn't mean they're going to be paroled. It just means they have the opportunity to go up before the parole board. And pretty much every single one in that group had served at least one life sentence, if not more. And so I thought I was there to teach them, and they really schooled me. I felt like I learned a lot more from them. And then I was hooked. I was like, I got to do this again.
Yeah.
Again.
How do you, so, I mean, I teach college, grad level and law school courses, and I know what it's like to walk into a room and have to win over the students, especially law students. How do you then get in that room and get them, I don't know if respect's the right word, but they have to have some level of respect to listen in any fashion. How do you get them to connect with you, I guess would be the right word. How do you get that connection with the student such that they will listen and share with you and vice versa?
Well, one of the things that's super important in prison is respect, and it has a whole different level of meaning than it does out here in the world. And so eye contact is something that people in prison often don't get very much of, especially from people that work there. And they are treated and subjugated in such a way that like they're less than human. And so the first thing I make sure to do is pay very special attention to my eye contact. And it might seem counterintuitive, but I make very strong eye contact with every single person. I make I take the opportunity to shake their hand and like shake it for real, where that's allowed. I've been in some prisons that's not allowed, but here it was. And I put people in the spotlight of attention, meaning like if you think about your body like a spotlight, you face somebody when they're talking to you, right? You give them your attention with your whole body. And every single part of me is showing up at like a cellular level as you're important. And I am grateful to be here with you. Right. And that energy carries through, and then you get it back. And that's not 100% of the time, but for the most part, it is. And I think also just by virtue of being a woman and being in a maximum security men's prison, there's a certain level of respect that you just showed up, right? By choice, not faculty or not staff, excuse me, but by, you're choosing to be faculty. So yeah. And then also once you build relationships with people, like people are people, and I just love stories. I love to hear about people and their life experience. And so I will go there with people regardless of how hard it is to hear what they have to say. And I have heard some stories that will, knock your teeth out. But I think it's important to like honor people's stories and the experience that they have lived. I remember one time at San Quentin, this man came up to me and we were talking about like job skills stuff or something like that. And he came up to me at the end of the class and he was like, "Rachel, I got to talk to you." And I said, "Yeah, what's up?" And he's like, "I am terrified of getting out of here." And I was like, tell me more. And he said, "You're talking to me about technology and how to use LinkedIn and all of these things." He's like, "I've never touched a computer. I've been in here since 1978. If that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what would, And it was like everything I could do to keep it together because God, I get it. I mean, I can only get it at such a level, but I cannot fucking imagine what that must be like and how terrifying that is. To think about having to like be out in the world, not just to get a job, but to just function, right? So that's what I mean when I say I learn more from them than they do from me. Who cares about LinkedIn when, you're talking about that kind of stuff. So those are the kind of conversations that I value more than anything, is just like unpacking that with somebody and like being with them in that conversation.
I think that's what makes a good teacher, though. I mean, so many times it's listening to your students and their experiences and letting that inform your own opinions and the way you teach and the way you act and the way you live.
Yeah, I have a handful of people that made an impact on me in the way that he did, that I have in my head all the time. There's another prison that Vic and I went to this last year called Pelican Bay. It's on the northern California border, right by Oregon. And it's a level 4 maximum security. It's a super max prison. It is the scariest prison I've ever been in, including San Quentin. And San Quentin actually isn't that scary, to be honest with you. The buildings are scary. The people aren't scary. But I would say probably 3/4 of the people that we met were covered head to toe in gang tattoos. There was somebody I worked with there named Michael in this exercise where we stood across the line from each other, facing each other. And it was like, step to the line if this is true for you, if that is true for you, etc. And there were some things that were true for me in my own life that were causing me to be emotional. And he was like mouthing the words to me, "It's okay. You got this." And this is somebody who was literally born into a gang in South Central LA, to a teen mom who was in a gang. He's never not been in a gang since he was born. And, we talked about a lot of stuff, but the thing that made the biggest impact on me, I think, was just the kind of eye contact he gave me and the respect. And I felt like I was more respected in that environment than out in the streets sometimes. So it's stuff like that and people like that that really change your perspective on what it means to be somebody who's incarcerated or formerly.
I think that's a good seg into talking about Unincarcerated Productions. How did you get involved with Unincarcerated?
So I was I had moved back from the Bay Area, was really missing working at San Quentin, and actually got in an argument with a boyfriend one Saturday morning. And I walked down to the coffee shop, picked up a newspaper, which, like, who does that anymore? And in it, there was this article about a program called University Behind Bars that was out at Monroe Correctional Complex, outside of Seattle. And I was like, by God, I'm going to find the people that run this program and I'm going to call them and I'm going to tell them, look, I worked at San Quentin, yada, yada, like, give me a job, free or paid, I don't care. And I did, and they did. And so they brought me into the minimum security unit first, and then another one called WSR. And I met somebody named Spencer Oberg, and he made a huge impact on me. And he was actually putting together this whole series called Harness Your Hustle. And so I was one of the speakers in that series, and he had put together this flyer that was better executed than most flyers I'd seen created in corporate America, whether virtual, like digital flyer or paper. And I was so impressed. And he got so many people to come to my class that it was standing room only. And it was like hot and muggy that day, and everybody stayed, and it was amazing. And so it was awesome. So then I was supposed to come back this one last time. And on my way there, I got rear-ended and got in a car accident. And so it was a bummer because it's not like you could just call him up and be like, "Hey, dude, I can't come." Like, he's in prison, right? He doesn't have a cell phone. And I can't call, like, I called the program, but they didn't get the message to him right away. So it was a real bummer. And then I think they stopped doing the series for a while. So cut to a couple of years later, I'd been working for this really intense startup in Seattle, and I got invited to go to this pitch competition at University of Washington. And I went with this woman named Kendall, and she's like, "Yeah, I know, like, my boss is coaching this team and they've got this nonprofit and they're pitching for funding. And this is like a social venture thing." I was like, "Cool, let's go." So I meet a bunch of people that day. And one of the people I ended up sitting next to, like right as the lights go down, is this guy. And I didn't know who he was, or I didn't think I knew who he was. And we were like voting with our phones on the different pitches, and we would side talk, like you do at a movie if you're that kind of person, where it's like, oh, that was really good, or oh, that one kind of sucked, or whatever. And the lights come on, and we look at each other, and he's like, Rachel? And I said, Spencer? And he had gotten out of prison, and I didn't know. And so of all the people in the whole place, we're sitting next to each other, and we were like, oh my God, like this is, fate. We gotta talk. And so he told me everything he'd been up to, and I've learned about Unincarcerated Productions and started having all these ideas firing at him. And he's like, I think maybe you should be part of our team. So that's how it all came to be. That was the genesis. And then I met Vic, and then I met Corey, and then it was weird because Vic did his time in Walla Walla, next to the penitentiary, or in the penitentiary that I grew up next to. And then Corey is like weirdly from the Walla Walla area, even though he's in LA. So there's like this weird Walla Walla connection.
So the vision of Unincarcerated Productions is very much driven by Vic and Spencer, who both served time. But I think something that makes it unique is everyone that is part of the team brings something to the table that's a little different and brings different ideas, and it kind of works well together. So I'm curious, what's your vision of what Unincarcerated is right now, and what it should be doing, and then moving forward, what could it become?
Yeah, right now it's a storytelling engine, and it's a way for us to put a spotlight on people who normally don't have a spotlight put on them, at least not a positive one, and to really elevate voices, right? And stories, like I was talking about earlier. And so I feel like that's where we're at now. I feel like where we can go, and part of my vision and what I'm bringing to the team is, in prison we call it programming, but basically it's like, how do we connect between telling stories and changing hearts and minds, and then activating that, like turning it into something where people who have housing instability and job instability and lots of other challenges re-entering society can actually have opportunity to thrive, right? To not have those instabilities. And so I see us like building a pipeline of people who can go into the media sector, the tech sector, like jobs that they actually want to be in and bring a lot to. And so, of course I'm a teacher at heart. So I always think about like the programming. And, I've been teaching in the Defy Ventures program here in Monroe for the last year or so. And my thinking has evolved about like what's possible, and like how to have a program that isn't just about empowerment, isn't just about job readiness or even entrepreneurship, but is like more holistic and more empowering, and less about like us teaching them, and more about like what can we help them create. And so I've seen some cool things happening around the country in different prisons that I'm using as inspiration for that, but I feel like we could even take it up a notch from there. So that's where I see us heading, is, providing jobs to people and opportunities, whether through us or, our pipeline of employers that are real, that are not cleaning toilets.
Knowing what you know now, what would you go back and tell yourself when you first got into the corporate world, that 21-year-old dealing with everything you were dealing with? How would you approach someone, either you at that time or someone that's you now, 21-year-old, 22-year-old, just entering the system, wants to make an impact on the world, but is stuck in this corporate rigidness that still exists to an extent, maybe not to the way it did back then, but absolutely still exists? What would you say?
I would say be the badass that you are, and stay the course, because it's gonna pay off at some point. And also, I think I would tell myself to like have some grace and patience to allow myself to like grow and learn and have more life experience. Because I think when I was 21, I wanted to change the world, but I didn't know how. And that caused a lot of angst and frustration and acting out. that were in ways that weren't necessarily good for me. And so I think I would tell myself to take better care of myself and to stay the course, for the badassery.
Is there anything we didn't talk about today that you think we should have talked about?
The only thing I can think about is Vic and I were talking about how much of an impact that this company I ran in San Francisco had on my beliefs and like the educational stuff that I bring to the table now. And that was a company called Social Fluency. And there were two Canadians who started it. And then one of them got another one of his companies funded and had to move to the Bay Area. And so I came on also as COO initially and eventually became president. And what we did was pretty remarkable in retrospect. We taught social and emotional intelligence to techie geeks. It was like a modern day charm school for techies. And so many amazing people came through that program that like they had so many cool things to offer. They were, smart and they had all these amazing life experiences and whatever. But there was sort of like this one X factor missing where they would get passed over, they'd have a hard time dating. They wouldn't get promotions at work or get put on cool projects and stuff like that. And they thought that it was something that couldn't be taught. They thought it was like an X factor that like you either have it or you don't, right? You're either cool and people like you, or you're a nerd and they don't, or they don't, take you seriously or whatever. We now know that nerds rule the world. And I kind of am applying that same realization to working with people who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated. Is like a lot of people come from a background and a perspective like, I'm shit, I'm always going to be shit. I come from a family that's been told that they were shit. And so there's like this intergenerational trauma that goes on that makes people think that they aren't worthy and that they don't have a lot to offer. But if we can just like put that X factor in there, they are very powerful. And so that's what I see, when I mean, Vic and Spencer are like obvious examples of this, right? Like they've absolutely have the X factor and have shown the world what they can do. And frankly, a lot of their, criminal history stuff, it was actually like learning for applying it to being an entrepreneur and, everything that they're doing now. So I think that the social fluency piece is really important to me because, it was 5 years of my life where we kind of had a testing ground for creating really interesting curriculum that changed lives. And so that's the last piece that I would add.
One final question then. One of the main tenets of Unincarcerated is to change the stigma around people having been incarcerated. What role do you think Unincarcerated itself can play in that process?
Well, it's what I said before about storytelling, because I think that stories, and particularly when you do it in, podcasts are becoming more and more popular and people are changing hearts and minds from listening to those. But I actually think the visual component is really important too. And so visual storytelling is something that a lot of people don't have access to with regard to the prison population, because you can't just walk up to a prison and be like, hey, let me in, I want to meet some people, right? It's a very select group of people that get to do that. And so when we get to go in and tell stories of people, I think that changes the stigma. And then long term, I think it's, if you have a neighbor or extended family member or whatever that has been incarcerated and you get to know them and you're like, oh, this is Joe, right? Like this isn't a ex-con, right? This is Joe. I know Joe. Then that's where the stigma actually really starts to shift. And guess what? Everybody has somebody that they know, even if it's second degree connection that's formerly incarcerated, I guarantee you, especially in the United States. We incarcerate more people per state in half of the states than any other country in the world. So I guarantee everybody knows somebody who it at least did jail time. And so I think that, telling people stories and actually knowing people and being in relationship with them, that's what changes the stigma.
Unincarcerated, the podcast, is a joint production of Unincarcerated Productions and Grindle Industries. All of the music on today's episode, including what you're listening to now, is from the artist Speculation. You can learn more about Spec at speculation.bandcamp.com. That's spekulation.bandcamp.com. We will see you all next time.